Take your Bibles, if you will, to Matthew chapter 5, verse 38. Whatever version you have, whatever context you want to read it in is fine. Doesn't matter. I'm reading out of the NIV this morning, and I'll be teaching out of that. And I want to talk to you about, in the course of Jesus' teaching to us on the Sermon on the Mount, after he gets past the Beatitudes. And let me just say one broad thing real quick. Don't forget, it's always about lordship. It's always about the very first of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the humble in spirit that love God, that are poured out, that are committed to God. That's the umbrella of everything. And so Jesus then from there begins to give all types of examples and teachings that we might grow, that we might learn, that we might be touched by him, that we might partner with him. And so we turn ourselves to verse 38, and suddenly we find ourselves in the midst of a very difficult teaching. Because Jesus is going to tell us words that we don't want to hear. Let's look, if you will, just look quickly with me. You have heard it said, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants you to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go the extra mile with him. Go 2. Give to the one who asks, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. I promise you, right now, people are like, I don't like this passage. This is not good for me. I get it. So here's a little bit of a context for you, if I may, because this verse really kind of comes out of the Old Testament law, the time that Moses, that God gave Moses the commandments, and he gave him the laws that they're to abide by. And in Exodus chapter 21, it says, if there is serious injury, God is telling Moses, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise, and it goes on, and you kind of get the context there. And you think, well, wait a minute, man, isn't that kind of weird? No, here's the thing. When somebody does something bad to you, you want more retaliation. So typically, if somebody takes my eye, I want to take both of theirs, right? I mean, we want equal and more. And so the law was set forth to control the boundaries of which you can retaliate. Now, this was the law. There was supposed to be exact compensation. Offenses against individuals were to be punished by the injured individual receiving back, but it had to be the exact payment, if you will, of the one that was injured. So here's the boundaries that God's establishing so that people don't get more than they give more than they got. There we go. So that people don't give more than they got. Person had rights, if you will, even though they were wrong and somebody was wronged. That's just not how it really goes down today. Jesus is telling us, in reality, I don't even want you to retaliate. I mean, this is what he is saying. You have heard it said, but I'm telling you, don't even resist an evil person. Wait a minute. How do you justify that? I'll tell you how in one word. Freedom. Freedom. Just let that dwell with you just for a moment. Freedom. Freedom. Wouldn't it be great in your life and mine if we could just free ourselves from the heart issue of getting even or retaliation? Family member says something bad to you and you want to get even. Or they gossip about you and that's even worse. And boy, and we get caught in this bondage that we cannot seem to shake. In fact, we worry about it, we're anxious about it. It puts us in a slavery. Wouldn't it be great to have the freedom from the bondage? I think we all deal with it too. I don't think it's anybody's immune. I think we all have to deal with this bondage that Jesus says, I want to give you a freedom. And as you partner with me, you'll experience that freedom. And if I may just randomly say this, just to get your thoughts on the same page as mine, Jesus stood before Pilate and never tried to defend. And that's the context of which we're speaking. That in our lives, that we want to have that revenge, and it creates angst in us. But Jesus simply said, you're the one who says I am, and you're right. And like a sheep to the slaughter, Jesus went and never thought about retaliation. And so in your fill-ins on your sermon notes, it's the attitude of heart to turn the other cheek, or giving the cloak, or going the extra distance, or giving as you would to someone who is in need. I'm going to unpack these four things this morning in just a brief order, if I may, because I'm really not telling you anything you don't already know. The issue that I'm trying to raise this morning is that Jesus says, get out of the bondage and learn to get into the freedom. And that's my goal. That's what I want you to walk away with. That every time that you're faced with this, I want to walk away with and have freedom. But you don't understand, Pastor. When they do something, I've got to retaliate. No, you don't. That's the bondage. So let me say that again, because maybe you didn't hear it. I've got to retaliate. I've got to have vengeance on somebody when they do something to me. No, you don't, actually. Because Jesus is telling you not to. But we feel like we do, but Jesus is saying no. So you don't have to. Well, then how am I going to get any satisfaction? That's the selfishness that we're in bondage to. Suffer the injustice, Jesus is saying, as he looks up into the eyes of the Pharisees, who in their heart want to kill somebody. And who is that? Jesus. They don't like him. They don't want him around. He's taking their job. He's taking people away, which means he's taking money away from them. And they're the ones that he's really kind of aiming at here and prodding. Don't worry about the injustice or this need of seeking revenge. Simply forgive and get out of the bondage and get into the freedom. I'm no different, church. People do certain things in my life, and right? I want to get even. I want to get back. I mean, this is a heart attitude that's got to be changed. I mean, there's an injustice happening, and the worst thing is I can't stand is I don't mind if somebody does something to me. People disagree with me all the time. I have issues with other people that don't like me. I'm okay with that. That doesn't matter to me. I've learned to get by that. But you do something that's unjust to somebody else, and I want revenge. I want to get even with them. But can I say this? What a restricting way to live. It just kills your day, your days, your week. It puts you in a bondage of just anxiety and frustration and anger. Look, life is short. Amen? Eternity's a long time, but we get to live here God put us here for a short time. And it seems to be getting shorter all the time. But we allow ourselves to be restricted in this. And so when we're tempted to decide how to act towards others according to how they acted toward us, or when we're wrong and our thoughts are focused on how do we get even, we're restricting our life. We want them to pay for what they've done. And in fact, it can become our obsession. God's got a word for us today. I know the word's freedom, but he's speaking into our lives today, because there's times where we see and we become obsessed to get even with people. And our lives are consumed with this desire for revenge, and it becomes deeper and deeper, and the passion defines our whole life, our whole purpose, if you will. Evil begets evil, truly it does. And it becomes our perpetual course in life, and it doesn't have to. One of my friends tweeted this week, I thought it was so good. I told him I'm not going to give him any credit for it, so I'm thinking this is from me, but it's not. Someone said, someone else can light your fuse, but the dynamite is all yours. The dynamite's all yours. But when I sweep out the gunpowder, all my fuss, all my fuses simply just fizzle out. So at some point, Jesus is saying, hey, just sweep out the gunpowder of your life. You don't need it. Next fill-ins. In order to obtain this new heart and attitude, we must learn to discipline our hearts, transform our hearts and mind by understanding the greater value of being like-minded with Jesus. I know it's a mouthful. Really focus on the last part. By understanding the greater value of being like Jesus. We don't often think about this. We think about it that we want to be this, but when Paul says, be imitators of Christ, when Paul says that statement, or when Jesus says, follow me, I mean, he's calling us into that freedom. He's calling us into that partnership of these great Sermon on the Mount snippets of how to live your life, how to orchestrate God's way. And so an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth can help limit the evil of a retaliation, if you will, but there's no life in it. There's no gospel in that. There's no difference. It just only means you're getting even. And so what the law does doesn't really help us overcome. It just allows us that we think to get a satisfaction into our life, when that really isn't the truth. It cannot bring joy, it cannot bring grace or life into a relationship, nor can it bring you closer to the living God by getting even. To live by the mindset, if you will, is to be bound in a cycle of reaction and action, and it doesn't lead to freedom. So what Jesus is guiding, the next fill-ins, what Jesus is guiding us to is to have a totally different attitude of heart. A life of freedom from evil. A life of freedom from anger and sin. So why turn the other cheek? Somebody slaps you, they deserve to get slapped back. Actually, no, they don't. And I'm going to unpack these real quick, just kind of historically, and then we're going to wind this up and wind it down this morning. According to the Jewish rabbinic law, to hit a man with the back of the hand was twice as insulting as to hit him with the back of the hand. So, wait. To hit a man with the back of the hand was twice as insulting. Now, here's the interesting thing. So when you hit somebody in the back of the hand across the face, doesn't matter which way you go, you can't hit them back with the back of the hand, right? Again. Okay, so you guys just think on that. You'll figure that out later, but you'll understand. I mean, you just simply cannot do it. But the insult was done. Nonetheless, the insult was done. And so what Jesus is saying, even man should direct the most deadly or calculated insult into your life, that he would absolutely humiliate you by slapping you with the back of his hand. You can't retaliate. Because there's nothing there. There's nothing there. Well, wait a minute, Pastor. You're calling us to be doormats. No, I'm not. Look, in our day and age, you do something outlandish like this, be careful, you get shot. So be careful. I mean, retaliation it has a price. So back in their day, when that wasn't necessarily the case, don't forget, I mean, these were probably people who were not good people, and you get beat up, or if it was a fairly good person, or maybe even a Jewish person, which this would have been very directed at the brothers. So if one of you comes up here and you backhands me in the face, my instant reaction is to punch you. I'm not violent, but, that would be what I want to do in my heart. And what Jesus is saying, why would you do that to a fellow believer? So if we look at it from the aspect of why would you want to do it to a fellow believer, why would you want to do it to a fellow human, why would you want to do it to even an evil person? Jesus says don't retaliate because humility. And I have to give you this before I finish the rest of this, because it only makes sense when you don't do this. Don't forget, each one of us is God's people. Oh, Hitler? Come on. God's people. Can I just keep going? The evilest person you think of, that you can think in your life, that you absolutely cannot stand, don't forget they're God's people. The Apostle Paul killed Christians. They should have taken him out. Aren't we glad they didn't? He killed believers. I'm telling you, the vilest of offenders, we need to be careful. So that's the platform of which all this stands. So why give the cloak? The tunic was a long sack inner garment made of cotton or linen, and the poorest man would have had at least a change of tunics. But the cloak was the great blanket, outer covering garment of which people wore, and they also used as blankets when they slept. So such a garment, a Jew would only probably have one. So now the Jewish law is saying that, or Jesus is telling, if a man takes your tunic, give him your cloak. Give everything. But the law said this, in Exodus chapter 22, if you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, his cloak, you shall restore it to him before the sun goes down. For it's his only covering. So this was the law, but Jesus is saying, look, give it to them. If they need it and they're that bad or they're that desperate, then just give it to them. Why? Well, don't forget, we have to keep in mind, these are Jesus' people as well. Even though you should expect it back, but what if it was a Roman soldier? What if it was an evil person? I think the key word is submission. Goes back to the first of the Beatitudes, that we're submissive to God. We're submissive to all people, but we're also submissive to God, that God, you'll provide. You'll provide. Why go the extra mile? There's always a threat of the Romans coming and saying, hey, look, you do this, you do that. And since Israel was under the Roman rule at the time and Roman occupation, they understood that. And here's the story. Jesus is carrying his cross down the walkway of Jerusalem, and he stumbles and falls, and he can't carry it anymore. And so what does he do? You know the story. The Roman soldier looks over and says, Simon of Cyrene, he didn't know who he is, says, you carry his cross. Well, should Simon of Cyrene not do that, the consequences would have been overwhelming for him. So what did he do? He picked up Jesus' cross and he carried it. So why go the extra mile? Why should we do this? Why should this fall on us, that when somebody says, hey, I need help? And well, I think the Christian has the right heart and the right mind of Jesus when he just helps out. It's called servanthood. Don't forget, these are God's people that we're talking about. Doesn't matter how heinous they are. So why give to those who ask? Well, giving's a privilege. It's an obligation in some aspects, but we have nothing to give to God. So being able to give to God's people or to people who need the help and even maybe don't need the help, they just simply want it because you've got it. I think there's a great demonstration of mercy here. And so this key word, give freely, why? Because we are still giving to God's people, and you do not know how to really make a difference in someone's life. And how do you impact them? Accept that maybe this action of giving freely. Oh, no. I'm not saying that we give to everybody every time somebody asks. No. Obviously, stewardship has to come into play here. I mean, if somebody's asking for something and they're horrible stewards, why would you give it to them? I think that's obvious, and I think that's certainly within what Jesus is talking about. That's why we give. That's why we go the extra mile. Here's my cloak. It's all I got, but here, if you need it, take it. You want to hit me? Okay. Go ahead. Let me give you the other cheek as well. You see, the problem of getting even from injustice is the sin of selfishness that it creates within us. Our loss within the kingdom will exceed the present gain. And if I could, the kingdom loss from our sin will outweigh the present pleasure. Thinking eternally, thinking spiritually, the opportunity lost from our sin exceeds the gain that it offers. Sin may look all that great, but it really isn't. You see, getting even is just hollow. It's empty. Well, it makes me feel better. Well, that's your sin that you've got to work out. I can't necessarily help you. Here's what Jesus said. And this is how he lived. First Peter says this. He says, when Jesus was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That's why I can say what I'm saying here today with great confidence. Paul reminds us Jesus' lifestyle, and he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, count others more significant than yourself. Why? Because they're God's people. The earth is full of God's people. Wait, you mean all the other countries? They're God's people. You cannot escape that. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others. Have this in mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, being God, taking on the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross. Wow. That's impressive. So here we are. I want to give you some things, just maybe some tools, because I want you to live in freedom. I want you to try to overcome. I want you to have better thoughts. I want you to have a clearer mind. I want you to have more beautiful opportunities that God rewards and not yourself getting the reward of being even. So when we talk about turning the other cheek or giving the cloak, going the extra mile, giving to those who ask, all of which I believe I have in your sermon notes, the scriptures that go along with them and correspond. I think by living these out, we do highlight the injustice in the world. We do highlight that there are things that are just wrong. A Roman soldier or somebody come alongside who has a higher maybe authority than you, we can highlight when we say, that's just wrong. in any way that's wrong. Almost prophetically, if you will, it draws attention to the oddity of being different in us. We become different. Why should we look like the world when Jesus calls us to be different? The reality of why we should live out these is to be different from the world. That's the whole point. Fill that in. We should be different. We've got to be different. We'll never help the world see our God if we're not different. And our God is different than from the world. That's what Jesus is trying to tell us. And the purpose of why we must live these things out is for others to see and be changed by our witness. So Jesus is calling us to be different, to go the extra mile, to give a little bit more, to simply turn the other cheek. I think the last thing that I would add on to this, and while I don't have a whole lot prescriptive to you today, here's the thing. You're a faithful follower of Jesus. Jesus always gets the last word, not you. Say amen. Because he does. You might think you do, but you're not going to. Trust him. Just trust him. You have faith in him. Trust him. You don't need to get even. You don't need to get it right. You don't need to get it back. You don't need to share insult to insult. You don't need to gossip because somebody else is gossiping. Just trust God. Just trust God. Nowhere in the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5:22, nowhere does it say that getting even is the gift of God. It doesn't even say that it's an attribute of a believer. There's nothing that says, and one of the fruit of the Spirit is vengeance and self-giving and self-serving or being stingy. None of that. None of those are the attributes they shouldn't be our attributes either. I told you this is not a fun message. Because it hurts a little bit. Because my guess is all of us could think a little bit of how we should retaliate. So what can you do right now to retain or retrain your heart? Retrain your mind to react differently. How can you retrain yourself? That's what I want you to think about. Well, what insecurities maybe a little bit deeper into our heart, what insecurities or wounds cause you to respond to an offense that is not the ways of Jesus? What is there? What does that look like? So how can you change that? And what's keeping you from fully loving others who are not nice to you? I'm not saying you have to like them. I'm saying you have to love them. Why? Because they're God's people. We have to change in a world so divided, in a world that is so full of hatred towards ethnicities, races, in every aspect, from politics to neighbors. How are they going to know Jesus ever if we're not any different than they are? You see, that's the message Jesus has given us. So how does that look for you in your life? What is that going to be? You mean you want me to go to my neighbor? I don't want you to do anything. Because you know me, I want to punch him too. But Jesus says, no, Mike, you don't get to do that. In fact, what I need you to do, Mike, is probably go make it right. Even though you probably won't make it right. Even though you probably won't make it right. Free yourself from the bondage of vengeance and retaliation. You just don't need to keep it. Let's bow together.